We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Launching Ariane from Kourou in French Guiana. Last night's launch was the 8th Ariane. 6 have been successful. Soon Ariane will be handed over by the European Space Agency to Arianespace, a consortium of 36 European companies out to make launching satellites a commercial as well as a technical success. It already has 27 firm orders to launch satellites like the one Ariane put into orbit early today. That's business worth £500 million. But Britain will see little of that because its stake in Ariane is small. France paid the lion's share of the £500 million it cost to develop Ariane. West Germany was the next biggest contributor. Britain put in only 2.5%. That means British industry received 2.5% of the contracts for building Ariane, and British companies have the same stake in Arianespace. Putting satellites into orbit will be big business. 200 will be launched in the next decade, and Arianespace wants a third of those for Ariane. That prospect looks distinctly possible after Ariane's rival as a satellite launcher, the American Space Shuttle, failed to put 2 satellites into orbit on its last mission. The failure wasn't in the shuttle, it was in the motors for lifting the satellites into the higher orbits they must occupy. But those motors are needed only because the shuttle cannot reach higher orbits. Ariane, on the other hand, can. The American Space Agency NASA is convinced that the next giant step for man in space will be space stations like these in low orbits. The shuttle or Ariane could be used to ferry up components during building. Space stations would be scientific laboratories and space factories to make new drugs and new kinds of chips for computers. The whole project would cost $8 billion. The Japanese are keen to take part, so are the Germans and Italians. NASA would like Europe as a whole, through the European Space Agency, to contribute $2 billion. But what's in it for Britain?
Well, a great deal. The opportunity to participate at the cutting edge of technology. The space program in its history has always held kind of a halo effect, or had kind of a halo effect over all R&D, and I think the public responds to it in a way that makes R&D in a country prosper, if you will, and do better.
We're talking here probably of an investment of 3- or 4-fold on what is committed at the present time. It's a very sad reflection on our spacefaring aspirations that the British taxpayer contributes, every man, woman and child, only approximately £1.50 per year to the space program in all of the taxes he and she pays, and that's a very, very small amount when the economic returns are 3, 4 and very often 5- and 6-fold on the investment.
The timing is such that if you want to be sure that you're going to be able to do the kinds of things that you want to do, that you come in early. If you want to come in later, it means some of the decisions will be made, and our flexibility to give you the kinds of things you're most interested in will be limited.
Publicly, Britain's response to NASA's invitation to join the space station project is polite interest. Privately, NASA is disappointed that Britain hasn't been more enthusiastic.
Lawrence McGinty.
The American Shuttle when it launches a British satellite next year. So now the competition is on to be the first Britons in space.
The Defence Ministry chose the Space Shuttle for satellite launches because NASA's offer included a place for a British crew member. The 3 services were trawled for suitable candidates, but when Mr. Heseltine walked in at this afternoon's press conference, there were 4 would-be spacemen with him, a soldier, a sailor, an airman and a civil servant. The soldier is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Boyle of the Royal Signals. He's a qualified parachutist, aged 43, and like the others, a science graduate. Commander Peter Longhurst, aged 41, is a Navy weapons specialist. His identity was revealed some weeks ago when his name was leaked to the press. Squadron leader Nigel Wood is a 34-year-old RAF test pilot who spent 3 years at America's Edwards Air Force Base. Christopher Holmes, the Deputy Project Manager of the Skynet 4 satellite program, is 33 years old and a career civil servant. He only learned 3 days ago that he'd been picked from thousands of candidates. Ahead of them lie months of intensive training, first on the British satellite team, then in America at the astronaut school. Only 2 of the 4 will be picked, so even now no one has more than a 50-50 chance of being the first Briton in space. Whoever Mr. Heseltine finally chooses will fly as a payload specialist at the end of next year. The other will go into space in 1986.
The 4 candidates to be Britain's first spaceman have been officially named today. 3 are officers from each of the services, the 4th is a civil servant. But only 2 of them will go into space next year and the year after.
The presentation of the 4 potential astronauts by the Defence Secretary was done with some style, with the Ministry building a special lunar set for the occasion, and a model of Skynet, the communications satellite which 2 of the 4 will be chosen to help launch. They start training immediately with regular trips to America before the first flight at the end of next year. 3 of them were only told they might be Britain's first man in space 10 days ago, while Commander Longhurst has been working on the project for over 2 years. Does this make him the front runner?
Well, it's not true at all. I mean, you've heard the Secretary of State has said there are 4 of us, and the choice will be made in due course. And I shall be doing my best to make sure that my partners in the team are brought up to speed.
What was your reaction when you heard, Colonel Boyle?
Initially, one of disbelief. It wasn't within my ken that a soldier might have the prospect to look forward to going in the shuttle. Having got over the disbelief and having been convinced that there was a possibility, then utter joy, of course.
Now, you have a candidate from the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Civil Service. Do you wish you were the government candidate?
Well, I think that I would, given the chance.
The Defence Secretary may not be in with a chance, but he'll be the one to choose who does go. Sue Lloyd-Roberts, News at 10 with Britain's Spaceman.
In America, another astronaut, Senator John Glenn, who's trailing badly behind Gary Hart and Walter Mondale in the race for the Democratic presidential nomination, looks like being on the point of giving up. Today he met his advisors in Washington, and tomorrow he gives a press conference there.
Sharma, a 35-year-old Air Force squadron leader, was accompanied by 2 experienced Russian cosmonauts. They'll dock with the Soyuz 7 orbiting space station tomorrow, and then spend a week conducting experiments and photographing the Earth.
The debut of India's first spaceman was broadcast live by Soviet television. The high publicity profile given to this flight has been greater than at any other time. It shows a return of self-confidence in Soviet technology and a determination to compete with America in grabbing world headlines. The plan is for the joint Soviet-Indian mission to stay in orbit for a week, performing medical experiments, photographing the Earth's surface, particularly the Indian subcontinent, and to fuse metal alloys in space. The Indian cosmonaut Rakesh Sharma will be using yoga to combat the muscular weakness caused by weightlessness. He'll also be taking fresh mangoes to the 3 cosmonauts in the orbiting space station Salyut 7, who've been up there for nearly 2 months. A 5-man American crew will be going into orbit aboard the shuttle on Friday. It's getting crowded up there these days as the space race gathers pace once again.
Soyuz spacecraft launched yesterday successfully docked with the orbiting space station Salyut. For the first time ever, 6 cosmonauts were together in one space station.
The moment the 2 Soviet spacecraft docked this afternoon was broadcast live on Soviet television, a sign of the unprecedented publicity surrounding this mission. It was a moment for self-congratulation. It's the first time India has had a man in space. He took with him a concentrate of curry and mangoes for a celebration dinner tonight. And they do have something to celebrate. It's the first time the Soviets have had 6 men aboard their orbiting space station. And if they feel any space sickness, the Indian cosmonaut is going to teach them how to combat it with yoga. In America, it's still all systems go for a launch of the shuttle on Friday with 5 astronauts aboard. The crux of their mission will be to repair a £200 million satellite. Known as Solar Max, it was launched 4 years ago to study solar flares and sunspots, events which, even at a distance of 93 million miles, can affect communications and the weather here on Earth. The satellite broke down 10 months after it was launched. Mission specialist George Nelson will use a backpack to make the 10-minute spacewalk to the satellite. He will first dock with the satellite and then use the nitrogen thrusters on his backpack to arrest its spin. The shuttle will then close in and use its remote manipulator arm to pick it out of orbit. It'll be dropped into a special cradle in the cargo bay where the repairs will be carried out. The astronauts will then spend 6 hours working on the satellite, and if tests prove it's working properly again, the mechanical arm will lift it out of the cargo bay and place it back into orbit again.
The crew of the United States Space Shuttle Challenger have been making their final preparations for today's launch. The 5-man team are due to blast off just before 3 o'clock this afternoon for the most ambitious voyage of the shuttle so far. They've been rehearsing the recovery from space of a broken-down satellite, which will be loaded into Challenger's cargo bay, repaired and finally returned to orbit in its hoped full working order.
It was launched this afternoon from Kennedy Space Center on what NASA describes as the most difficult space mission since the moon landings. The 5 astronauts on board will capture, repair and put back into orbit a crippled satellite. That's the first time that's ever been done. Today's launch went without a hitch and created a new space record. With 5 astronauts in orbit and 6 cosmonauts on the Russian space station, there are more people in space than ever before. And that's not counting 3,000 bees taken up on the shuttle to find out how they behave in weightless conditions.
100 miles above the Earth, the 5-man crew of America's Space Shuttle Challenger are tonight preparing for the project's most ambitious task yet, to capture and repair an orbiting satellite, which hasn't worked for 3 years. They'll also be launching another satellite. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson is watching the mission.
Commander Bob Crippen led out his 5-man crew for the start of the most spectacular mission yet attempted. It's the 11th shuttle flight. Challenger will be 260 miles high, the highest orbit yet for a shuttle flight. The launch went well.
Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger and the first flight to repair a satellite in space. We have cleared the tower.
The cloudless sky gave a spectacular view of the solid rocket boosters breaking away. The satellite the astronauts will mend is called Solar Max. It was launched 4 years ago to study solar flares and worked well for a time. Then it blew 3 fuses in its attitude control system and could no longer be pointed accurately at the sun. Engineers put the satellite into a slow spin to stabilize it, but were bitterly disappointed at the failure. On Sunday, an astronaut will put on a maneuvering backpack and jet across to the satellite 300 feet away, dock with it and stop its slow spin. The shuttle will approach, grab it with its remote-controlled arm and set it in a cradle in the payload bay.
Once the satellite is in the payload bay, it'll have to be turned on its cradle to bring it into the correct position for the astronauts to work on it. That means it'll be tilted slightly so the solar panels don't hit the tail. Then the astronauts have 3 jobs to do. First, they'll remove the damaged attitude control system and place it there. In its place, they'll put a fresh one brought from Earth. Next, they'll place a small cover over a vent in the side of the satellite to prevent gas getting in and contaminating an instrument. Then, towards the end of the mission, they'll try the most ambitious repair of all. They're going to cut into the side of the satellite here with a pair of scissors and expose a small electronic box which needs repair. NASA knows this will be a difficult mission, but they're optimistic at least some of it will be completed successfully.
The astronauts have practiced hard in the water tank, using power tools to loosen bolts and screws. Astronaut Dr. George Nelson, known as Pinky, will be capturing the satellite. He's an astronomer, but has put in months of hard training for his unique task. He's 33, married with 2 daughters. James Van Hoften, known as Ox, will do the repair. He's 39, married with 2 girls and a boy. It's a daring mission, and if successful will herald a new era in space flight. The orbital repairman will have become a reality.
The Russians say the shuttle program is a military maneuver because America sees space as a potential scene of battle against socialist countries. Instead of the American shuttle, television viewers throughout the Soviet Union were shown pictures of India's first man in space. He accompanied a Russian crew into orbit this week. They linked up with other cosmonauts aboard the Salyut space station and practiced yoga exercises.
American Shuttle mission had a copybook launch today. The 5-man crew are now preparing to track down a broken satellite to carry out the first ever repairs in space.
4 out of the 5 astronauts making the trip today have never been into space before. But the Shuttle Challenger has been into orbit 5 times. This time it's carrying its heaviest ever payload and will be climbing higher than ever before, some 287 miles.
3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger in the first flight to repair a satellite in space. We have cleared the tower.
The shuttle was also carrying another 3,000 passengers today. They're honeybees, part of an experiment designed to find out how they'll build a honeycomb in the weightless conditions of space. 13 million tomato seeds are on board as well. They'll be dropped off in orbit and picked up next year. But the most important part of the mission will take place on Sunday, when the astronauts will attempt to retrieve and repair a satellite which broke down 4 years ago. The flight also marks another space record. When you count the 6 cosmonauts on board Russia's space station, it'll be the first time that 11 men have been in Earth orbit.
The American Space Shuttle Challenger are now in orbit 300 miles above the Earth, preparing to launch a satellite later today. They've been moving equipment around the cargo bay from where the satellite will be sent spinning into space. It contains more than 50 scientific experiments. The astronauts have also been testing the shuttle's robot mechanical arm, which they'll use to retrieve another satellite tomorrow. They're hoping to repair it and relaunch it. Despite the busy schedule, the astronauts found time for a joke with Mission Control.
Roger, Pinky. We were wondering how it's going up there. Are you guys having a good time? Stand by, I'll take a poll.
Challenger are getting ready for the main task of their day, placing a huge 10-ton satellite in space containing more than 50 scientific experiments. The flight has been faultless so far. The astronauts were woken up this morning by the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue. Already they've begun testing the shuttle's new remote control arm developed in Canada. It's 50 feet long and will be used to move out the satellite this afternoon. It'll also be used for tomorrow's more ambitious task, catching and repairing a satellite already in space.
We were wondering how it's going up there. Are you guys having a good time? Stand by, I'll take a poll.
Aboard the American Space Shuttle Challenger are getting ready to launch a special space platform. They'll use it to carry out scientific experiments in orbit.
The astronauts were putting the shuttle's robot arm through its paces today. It's not been 100% reliable before, and it's needed to deploy a platform full of experiments, which will be dropped into orbit in just under 4 hours' time to be picked up on a later mission next year. There didn't seem to be any problems with it today.
Checkout complete. All platforms in the berthing position. Everything went on time and no anomalies at all.
Also in orbit at the moment are 6 cosmonauts, including India's first spaceman aboard the Soviet space station Salyut-7. They've been wearing bracelets on their arms and legs to cut down the blood flow to their heads in an apparently successful attempt to reduce space sickness.
Putting a 10-ton satellite into orbit. They're due to complete it in about half an hour. The satellite contains more than 50 scientific experiments. James Wilkinson reports.
The astronauts were in good spirits this morning. So far, everything had gone according to plan. They tested the Canadian-built remote-controlled arm, due to be used to lift a 10-ton satellite from the payload bay and deploy it in orbit. The satellite has over 50 experiments on board. It will be left in space and collected again next year. There was even time for some relaxed banter with Mission Control.
We're wondering how it's going up there. Are you guys having a good time? Stand by, I'll take a poll.
But the real test will come tomorrow when astronaut George Nelson is due to capture the crippled Solar Max satellite. It'll be brought into the payload bay by the remote-controlled arm and repaired. It'll be an historic first, but NASA is not underestimating the difficulties ahead.
The
India's first spaceman, Rakesh Sharma, has been telling television viewers back home about life on the Soviet space station Salyut 7. He and 2 Soviet cosmonauts docked on Wednesday to join 3 others already there. Sharma has been instructing the other spacemen in yoga. Until recently, yoga was frowned on in the Soviet Union because of its religious associations. But now it's being used to help the spacemen cope with weightlessness.
Day of America's Shuttle Challenger. The 5 astronauts have put their science platform into orbit, and all the world's gardeners are watching to see what happens.
The astronauts were putting the shuttle's robot arm through its paces today. It's not been altogether reliable before. It was needed tonight to deploy an experimental platform. It'll be picked up from orbit by another shuttle mission in 10 months' time. It contains 57 experiments in all, including several million tomato seeds, to see how they're affected by long exposure to space. The robot arm was working perfectly, and there were no problems with the deployment tonight.
Checkout complete. All platforms in the berthing position. Everything went on time, and no anomalies at all.
Also in orbit at the moment are 6 cosmonauts, including India's first spaceman, aboard the Soviet space station Salyut 7. They've been wearing bracelets on their arms and legs to cut down the blood flow to their heads in an apparently successful attempt to reduce space sickness.
And that's the news on the Earth and off it so far tonight. Good night.
Repair of a disabled satellite in orbit. 2 of the astronauts will work outside the space shuttle using jet backpacks, one of them flying about 200 feet to the satellite Solar Max to harness it. Yesterday, the astronauts launched the largest object ever carried into space by a shuttle, a 30-feet-long, 10-ton platform. Astronaut Terry Hart took control of the shuttle's robot arm and propelled the platform, known as the Long Duration Exposure Facility, out of the cargo bay and into orbit. Commander Robert Crippen reported success.
Roger that. Thank you very much.
The satellite contains 57 experiments and will remain in orbit until it's recovered on another shuttle flight in February next year. The 5-man crew watched the platform draw away, with the sun reflecting on it as it passed over California. Among the items on board to be tested over long periods in space are 12 million tomato seeds, which on their return will be given to school children for classroom experiments.
Space Shuttle Challenger have failed in their first bid to carry out a satellite rescue 287 miles above the Earth. Mission specialist George Nelson had to cut short his spacewalk and return to the shuttle before he could link up with the crippled Solar Max satellite. It was to have been scooped up into Challenger's cargo bay for repairs.
In the last few hours, the shuttle Challenger has been edging towards the crippled satellite, matching its height and its speed. It closed to within just 200 feet of the satellite before astronaut George Nelson strapped on his backpack and began his spacewalk. He's never been into orbit before, let alone walked untethered in space, but NASA were confident about their backpacks after their performance on the last mission. Nelson had to maneuver his way past the solar panels of the satellite, spinning in space like giant windmill arms before moving in and attempting to dock with it. Then, using the nitrogen thrusters on his backpack, he had to try and slow the spin. But after several attempts to dock with it ended in failure, Nelson feared his supply of nitrogen gas in his backpack, the gas which powers the spacewalk, was running low, so he was forced to return to the shuttle. There are now 2 options left. Either Nelson goes out again and tries with a second backpack to dock more forcefully with the satellite, or the shuttle tries to move in with its robot arm and arrest the spin before bringing it back into the cargo bay for repairs.
To retrieve a disabled satellite in orbit, but so far they've failed. James Wilkinson has been following this most complicated part of the shuttle mission 300 miles above the Earth.
It started well. The shuttle was just 200 feet from the Solar Max. Astronaut George Nelson, strapped into his backpack, launched himself towards the satellite.
You're doing okay?
It took about 10 minutes to make the journey, travelling at about half a mile an hour. It was later, when he approached between the solar panels, that the trouble started. He docked onto the satellite, but the latches on the satellite failed to close. He drew away and tried to stop the satellite by holding onto one of the solar panels, but that didn't work. Nelson abandoned that attempt and returned to the orbiter. What they're trying to do now is grapple the satellite with the remote-controlled arm, while the satellite is still spinning. It's a slow spin, but it's a risky maneuver. There's always a chance they could damage the remote-controlled arm, which could mean the satellite repair would be impossible. NASA has said that if they can't get the satellite into the payload bay, they would not try to repair it while it was floating free. So at the moment, the success of this mission hangs very much in the balance.
Yeah, 1200 on one side, yeah, 1200 on both sides. I guess so.
Okay, come on back in, thanks.
There he is just returning to the orbiter after having failed to stop the satellite spinning.
To your left, continue left. I mean, which way is the satellite?
Mission specialist George Nelson had to cut short his spacewalk without managing to dock with the crippled satellite Solar Max.
This afternoon, the Shuttle Challenger edged towards the satellite, matching its height and its speed. As it closed to within 200 feet, astronaut George Pinky Nelson strapped on his backpack to make contact. He's never been in orbit before, let alone on an untethered spacewalk. The journey took 20 minutes.
Looking good, Pinky. Okay.
To get close, he'd have to maneuver his way past the solar panels of the satellite, spinning in space like a giant windmill. That's him as a white blob to the right of Solar Max. Now he's closer, and they've realized the satellite was spinning at twice the speed that was expected. Several attempts to dock with it ended in failure. The jaws of the docking mechanism simply failed to clamp onto the satellite. Nelson then attempted to stop it spinning by holding onto its solar panels. But every attempt he made simply made the problem worse. The satellite started rotating faster than before. Eventually he realized his nitrogen gas supply in his backpack, the gas which powers him through space, was running low, and he was ordered to return to the shuttle. Magnetic control devices were then turned on in the satellite to try and control its spin, and the shuttle moved closer to try and grab the satellite with its robot arm. But 2 attempts failed. They'll try the same thing again tomorrow. David Scott, who landed on the moon on the Apollo 15 mission and who has been in space 3 times, including 5 spacewalks, knows all about the problems that crop up when you're up there on your own. Is training on Earth ever enough to enable you to confront what you will face in space?
Well, it's enough to put you in a physical environment in which you can use man's intelligence and his judgment to evaluate a surprise, but you can never anticipate the surprises you get in the unknown. But of course, I think the beauty of the flight today is that we're there at all, that man is there at all, attempting to bring back a satellite.
Their second attempt to retrieve a damaged satellite until tomorrow. Scientists at Cape Canaveral announced this morning that they were delaying the maneuver by 24 hours. Yesterday, one of the astronauts, George Nelson, tried to latch onto the satellite, Solar Max, to stop it spinning, but twice he bounced off the craft.
I hit the thing square on, I bounced out, and I went back in and hit it again, and it didn't snap either time.
As a last attempt, the astronaut tried to stabilize the satellite by grabbing one of its solar panels, but had to give up when his fuel began to run out. Well, what chance do the astronauts have of recovering the satellite when they do try again tomorrow? I've been joined in the studio by the space consultant Jeffrey Pardo. Jeffrey, before you answer that, could you perhaps explain why NASA have had to postpone this maneuver?
Yes, because they now have to use this rather crude magnetic torque device to make the satellite rotate very slowly indeed, which is the only chance left, and that takes rather a long time to do. So they need the extra day to really slow it down to the exact conditions they want.
I gathered that they had actually slowed it down so much that the pin was on the wrong side.
Yes, to that extent they overdid it, but now they're just going to put it into a very slight rotation, 1 revolution every 12 minutes, and then when the right pin comes round by the actual shuttle, then the remote manipulator system, the big robot arm, will go out and latch onto it. That's the plan.
So this isn't going to be another spacewalk?
No, I'm afraid not. They've really used the fuel up for the manned manoeuvring unit, the backpack the astronauts would use. They have to conserve that, of course, because the astronauts will be out, then hopefully effecting the repair and actually locking the Solar Max into the cradle in the payload bay. but the actual retrieval now has to be done by the arm. There's not enough fuel to go out and do what they had hoped to be the main way of bringing it back in.
I know we've learnt not to be too optimistic these days with shuttle missions, but what chance do you think they have of succeeding?
I think they have a good chance now. This type of retrieval has been carried out several times, with satellites that have been put out and then brought back as an experiment. This is the first time a completely remote satellite has been brought in. But the technique has been demonstrated by this arm. It's a pity the men didn't do it this time. I'm sure they will next time. But I think tomorrow should be every chance of success with the conditions they've now created on the Solar Max.
Of course, repairing this satellite was the whole point of the mission in the first place, and now they've lost 2 days effectively, and they're going to be running up against time problems, are they not?
I think so. There's quite a flexibility, though, in the shuttle. There's no great problem about staying up an extra day or even 2 days for this particular mission. So I think the key will be, will they achieve their primary mission? That's what everything hangs on, I think.
So if they do manage to get the satellite back, do you think that they would stay up and repair it there rather than bring it down to Earth perhaps and launch it again another time?
Oh yes, I think they will. I think they can probably condense into 1 day what they had spread into 2 days had they brought the satellite back first time. They were going to repair one box and then finish off another part of the satellite the day afterwards. I think they'll probably now condense that, and probably can, because the astronauts themselves won't have to be exposed to the hard work of going out and bringing it back to begin with. Now, I think that with the usual flair and ingenuity and versatility, the chance is now that NASA and the astronauts will probably complete the mission satisfactorily, albeit somewhat delayed, and albeit learning that they have to take exceptional care to get the little bit of mechanics right, the bit which actually didn't latch on, which is a terrible shame.
Well, we hope that it does work this time. Thank you very much, Jeff, for coming in.
In orbit will now be staying up until Friday, and the astronauts will have another crack at latching onto the satellite tomorrow. This time they'll use the shuttle's robot arm for the job before hopefully lifting the satellite into Challenger for repairs.
Solar Max, the countdown has started for the final attempt. Hello. The astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Challenger are preparing for the second and final attempt to rescue the damaged satellite Solar Max from space. It was originally planned for today, but this morning scientists at Cape Canaveral announced they were delaying it until tomorrow. They're hoping the extra time will give the crew a better chance of success. The astronauts, who call themselves the ACE Repair Team, aren't depressed by yesterday's failure to rescue Solar Max. From Cape Canaveral, Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnell reports.
Nothing went right for astronaut Pinky Nelson's rescue mission. He flew between the spinning solar wings without difficulty, but 3 attempts to dock and then stop the spinning all failed. It thought the latches on his docking unit got too cold to work. So Commander Crippen told him to grab one of the panels, fire his jet thrusters, and try to steady it that way. But by the time he'd finished, instead of being steady, the satellite was wobbling in all directions. And by then, Challenger had used so much maneuvering fuel, no more free flights were possible because not enough was left for a rescue maneuver if he got into trouble. 4 attempts with the robot arm to grab the satellite have also failed, but after a day's rest, they'll be trying that again tomorrow. If that succeeds, Challenger's flight home will be delayed until Friday, the 13th. This was originally the 13th shuttle flight, and after what happened to Apollo 13, spacemen here think that's a very unlucky number.
The damaged satellite has been delayed until tomorrow. Yesterday's attempts were unsuccessful.
I hit the thing square on, I bounced out, and I went back in and hit it again, and it didn't snap either time.
Astronaut George Nelson was forced to give up when the fuel in his backpack began to run out. Now Challenger's robot arm will be used.
Salyut 7 space station tried some more yoga this morning. Rakesh Sharma was trying to find out if it could prevent space sickness. Later he was asked by Mission Control if he kept his 5 Russian colleagues awake by snoring.
I suggest you ask this question of my wife. She'll be able to give you the answer.
And that's it so far this evening.
As well as they do it on Earth. The next attempt to rescue the crippled Solar Max satellite will now take place tomorrow. Yesterday the manoeuvre was abandoned when one of the astronauts couldn't latch on to the satellite.
On the Russian space station Salyut 7, 6 cosmonauts, including India's first spaceman, have been answering questions from Indian journalists. They weren't all about scientific achievements.
Snores while sleeping in Salyut 7, and how does it affect the Salyut 7 flight path, I would like to know. So you don't know whether he is snoring or not, because both of you will be sleeping together and simultaneously maybe.
I suggest you ask this question of my wife. She'll be able to give you the answer.
The mission was intended to do, to pick up from orbit and repair the faulty satellite Solar Max. The first attempt by astronaut Pinky Nelson floating freely in space failed because he couldn't lock onto the satellite and stop its spinning movement. Shortly they'll make another attempt using the shuttle's special robot arm. All morning the shuttle's been creeping closer to the satellite, to within 85 feet in the next few minutes. Here's some of the live NASA commentary going out to the American public.
Oh, sure, going to check that thing out before they do redeploy it. If indeed something occurs that the satellite cannot be deployed, the satellite is equipped with explosive bolts, detonators on the solar wing panels that will detach them from the solar maximum satellite. At that point it will be...
Paul McDowell.
Success at last as the American astronauts rescue Solar Max. Hello. The damaged satellite Solar Max is now safely on board the American Space Shuttle Challenger. The astronauts turned disaster to triumph this afternoon when the last-ditch attempt to rescue the stranded satellite went perfectly. They were able to use Challenger's remote control arm to grab Solar Max and maneuver it on board. One other attempt on Sunday had ended in failure. Newsround Space Editor Reg Turnell has been following today's activities from Kennedy Space Center.
Success came when Commander Bob Crippen slid Challenger directly beneath the satellite. Then Terry Hart, peering through the flight deck's overhead window, grabbed it, first go, with the robot arm. The job was made easy because radio signals had halved the satellite's spin rate, and Canada's robot arm had succeeded where a free-flying astronaut failed. At the crucial moment, Challenger was out of TV range, so we had a tense wait.
Okay, we've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSF.
After that came another anxious hour while the satellite was gently lowered into the special cradle in the cargo bay, tilted so that its 8-meter wingspan didn't damage Challenger's tail, and turned so that tomorrow it can be repaired. That'll need a 6-hour spacewalk by Nelson and Van Hoften, who will both be tethered this time. By Thursday, Challenger should be able to place it back in orbit to resume its all-important study of the sun. It's a huge step forward for space technology.
The faulty satellite Solar Max. They've taken it on board for repairs. Yesterday, one of them, floating free in a jet suit, failed to hold the spinning satellite. Today, they used the shuttle's robot arm. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reporting.
For 2 days, the success of the mission had hung in the balance after George Nelson failed to dock with the satellite. Their last hope was to slow down the satellite's spin using on-board stabilizers and then try to grapple it directly with the remote-controlled arm. This afternoon, they succeeded at the first attempt.
Okay, we've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSF.
Outstanding.
The satellite is now being berthed on a cradle in the payload bay, ready for repairs to begin tomorrow. If the repairs prove impossible to do, Solar Max will be brought back to Earth.
Shows Solar Max sitting in the cradle. The latches slowly closing over the satellite base to fix it firmly in place. Then the electrical connections to the satellite were made, so scientists could communicate with the satellite through the shuttle. Finally, the satellite was rotated to bring the attitude control system to the front, ready for tomorrow's repairs.
Solar Max. The shuttle's robot arm latched onto the satellite 300 miles above the Earth.
There was to be no second chance for the astronauts this time. The failure to capture the satellite on Sunday used up all but 13% of the fuel in the shuttle's nose control rockets, the thrusters needed for today's delicate operation. Also, the way it was manhandled left it spinning and tumbling faster than ever before. But by switching on magnetic devices inside the satellite, they managed to slow it down again. That fact was crucial to the success of today's operation. The shuttle's 50-foot-long robot arm was used to put a wire lasso round a shaft on the satellite before it was pulled in.
Getting a good picture. It looks like you're just about there.
Okay, we've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSF.
Outstanding.
To NASA officials on the ground, the success of the operation was an immense relief. It marks the end of the age of expendable satellites. The Solar Max satellite is now safely latched onto a cradle inside the shuttle's cargo bay, with its giant solar panels sticking out over the edge. 2 astronauts will go out with their toolkits tomorrow to carry out repairs.
That has been quite a busy day in space. But today there comes a really exciting piece of news about by far the most ambitious project so far. The Soviet Union has plans to build a gigantic mirror out in space to beam sunlight down to Earth. It could literally turn night to day.
Today's rescue of Solar Max is proof beyond doubt that space vehicles can be used to maneuver in orbit, carrying out repair or construction work of almost any type. Of course, ever since space travel became a reality, scientists have been developing plans for large projects in orbit. Space stations could be used for industrial manufacture, agriculture, or simply as a weightless environment for experimental research. But what Soviet scientists are now working on are giant mirrors that could be assembled out in space, covered in a lightweight material and positioned to collect the maximum amount of sunlight. The mirror could then be maneuvered to point the sun's rays at any place on Earth in need of heat or light.
Jeffrey Potter, why would they use the mirror? Exactly what purposes would it go to?
Well, first of all, of course, you can illuminate a city, which is a very important thing, but you can also illuminate large construction sites in developing areas around the world. You can illuminate fields for harvest time, for example. On a more sort of emergency basis, if you have an earthquake, then you have a great problem and you need light, so you can do that.
Can it be remotely cost-effective?
Well, yes. The Russians calculate that in terms of illuminating cities, it could be paying back in about a 5 or 6 year period. But I mean, it's not just that. For example, fog is sensitive to humidity and temperature. So if you concentrate a little bit, because you're reflecting heat as well as light, you can possibly do quite a bit in terms of fog at airports and that sort of thing. You can take the frost off of the big orchards of orange crops in California, etc., etc.
See, I never know whether these things are science fiction or not.
I'm not kidding.
Presumably they can't take great chunks of glass mirror up into space. That would weigh far too much. So how practical, how realistic is it?
Oh, it's quite realistic in that sense. I mean, the technology is with us now. What you would do is to construct a very, very light but rigid framework, and you could just put silvered plastic, mylar, which we use all the time in spacecraft, over it and construct a very large surface to act as a mirror.
And when could it be done?
It could be done before the end of this decade in terms of an experimental and emergency system. By the middle of the next decade, I think, if things work out and the measurements are all right and people are going to pay for it and feel it's useful, it could certainly be yet another practical application of space.
Quite an exciting prospect. Jeffrey Potter, thank you very much. Sally.
The Challenger has succeeded in a totally new maneuver which proves it can recover valuable satellites that would otherwise be lost. On Sunday, the astronaut George Nelson had failed in an attempt to catch the crippled satellite Solar Max using a rocket backpack to walk to it in space. Today's retrieval attempt with a remote control arm was the last chance because fuel is running low. Lawrence McGinty with this report.
Ever since George Pinky Nelson left Space Shuttle Challenger on Sunday morning to make history by being the first astronaut to capture a satellite, events have proved that there really are banana skins in space. The biggest problem was the grappler held in front of his chest. It was this fairly simple mechanical device that should have locked onto a trunnion pin on the crippled Solar Max satellite. The thruster backpack, in operation for the first time, took Nelson across to Solar Max without problem. But when he reached the satellite and tried to capture it, the mechanical jaws of the grappler simply failed to work. That meant he couldn't use the thrusters in his backpack to stop Solar Max spinning. Nelson tried in some desperation to grab the solar panels and manually stop the satellite spinning. He only succeeded in accelerating the spin and making Solar Max tumble too. Yesterday, NASA succeeded in controlling that spin by activating from the ground internal stabilizers on the satellite. But Shuttle had used a lot of fuel, keeping position close to Solar Max. It didn't have enough reserves to rescue Nelson if anything went wrong on another spacewalk. So NASA decided to grab Solar Max with the Canadian-built manipulator arm instead. This afternoon was Challenger's last chance to capture Solar Max. The shuttle was out of radio contact. When signals finally came through, it was good news.
We've got it. Okay. We've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSS.
Outstanding.
The arm had grabbed Solar Max at the first attempt. The crippled satellite is now sitting snugly on a special cradle at the back of the shuttle's payload bay. The astronauts have already turned it round so they can get at the parts that need replacing. Tomorrow, they'll have to squeeze 2 days' repair work into one because of the delay in capturing Solar Max. First, they'll replace a box of electronics at the base of the satellite. It was a fuse that blew in this equipment that crippled Solar Max, making it impossible to point the satellite at the sun for its measurements of solar flares. Then, a much more fiddly job, fixing faulty electronics in one of the instruments on the satellite. Shuttle's job is far from finished, but scientists are delighted by today's success.
Marvellous. It shows the benefits of the shuttle and of having man in space, that problems which seemed so severe on Sunday when we failed to capture the satellite, that they've been overcome today, and we now have Solar Max safely in the cargo bay of the shuttle in order to repair it tomorrow. But if they manage to repair the main box which controls the pointing of the spacecraft will be reflown. However, if they run into major difficulties, then the solar arrays either side of Solar Max will be jettisoned, and Solar Max will be returned to Earth to be repaired down here and reflown on a later shuttle flight later this year or next.
So overall, is it a success for Shuttle or not?
I think it is, yes. The main object of this mission was to grab Solar Max and to repair it in space. And although the shuttle has performed flawlessly, it shows that these difficult things cannot be expected to be done first time in space.
It may have taken 2 attempts, but the shuttle has proved it can capture satellites costing hundreds of millions of pounds that would otherwise have to be abandoned when they go wrong.
Now more news of today from our guest from Hong Kong television.
Of the American Space Shuttle Challenger this afternoon. The crew will now set about repairing it. Here's a report from our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
For 2 days since George Nelson failed to dock with the satellite, the fate of the mission hung in the balance. This morning, as the shuttle began closing on the Solar Max for a final attempt at capture, spirits were high. NASA had slowed the satellite down until it was spinning at only 1 revolution every 12 minutes. They were confident, but they knew it would be difficult. Astronauts had released and captured a stationary satellite before, but this one was moving. In the event, they caught it first go.
Okay, we've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSS.
Outstanding.
The satellite was gently lowered towards the payload bay and set on a cradle. Latest pictures show the latches on the cradle gently closing on the base of the satellite to fix it in position. Then the electrical connections to the satellite were made. Scientists can now communicate directly with Solar Max through the shuttle. Finally, the satellite was rotated to bring the attitude control system to the front, ready for tomorrow's repairs. They had never planned to capture the satellite this way. The fact that they could do it at all shows how versatile their equipment is. If tomorrow's repairs can't be done, they can now bring the satellite back to Earth. Apart from demonstrating how a mission can adapt to changing circumstances, that moment of capture saved £200 million, the cost of the Solar Max satellite. Tonight, NASA will be celebrating.
The Americans say the Russians will have their own space shuttle in operation within the next few years. The disclosure came today when the Pentagon published its annual review of Soviet forces. And as well as advances in space, the report reveals that the Russians have been making great progress in weapons development. Our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne reports.
American analysts have worked out how the Soviet vehicle will compare. Although it's smaller, it will carry the same 15-ton payload, which will be useful in the construction of this planned space station. Other systems, which look like their Western counterparts, include this long-range cruise missile, which can be launched from submarines. And a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier now building at a Baltic shipyard will be similar to American ships. The number of SS-20 mobile rockets deployed has increased to about 370, and there's a new intercontinental system on trial, the SSX-25. Most of the intelligence data has been gathered from spy satellites, but for security reasons, the illustrations are artists' impressions. One exception is the Soviet build-up in Nicaragua, illustrated by reconnaissance photographs. The report claims this is evidence of a growing Soviet threat to an area of vital concern to the United States.
The crew of the American space shuttle Challenger have managed to capture the damaged satellite Solar Max, which they were sent into space to repair. The shuttle had to climb deeper into space than it's gone before to reach the satellite.
There was to be no second chance for the astronauts this time. The failure to capture the satellite on Sunday used up nearly all the fuel in the shuttle's nose control rockets, the thrusters needed for today's delicate operation. Also, the way it was manhandled left it spinning and tumbling faster than ever before. But by switching on magnetic devices inside the satellite, they managed to slow it down again. That fact was crucial for today's operation. The satellite was plucked out of space and dropped into the cargo bay with the shuttle's robot arm.
Okay, we've got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSF.
Outstanding.
To NASA officials on the ground, it was a moment to release the tension of the last 2 days. A satellite need no longer be expendable. The Solar Max satellite is now safely locked onto a cradle inside the shuttle's cargo bay, with its solar panels sticking out over the edge. 2 astronauts will go out with their toolkits tomorrow to carry out repairs. But tonight, the whole crew up there were just celebrating the fact that their mission had been a success. What they have to do tomorrow is replace 3 blown fuses in the satellite, which was put into orbit 4 years ago to study the sun. It will be difficult work using bulky space gloves and working with scissors and small screws. It's expected to take some 5 hours, and if successful, they'll drop it back into orbit tomorrow night.
The work is expected to last at least 6 hours. Meanwhile, the Russian Soyuz craft has landed successfully in Soviet Central Asia after undocking from the Salyut space station. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson has been following this morning's developments.
The astronauts woke up this morning to a beautiful sight, the satellite safely stowed in the payload bay. They were congratulated by President Reagan.
So, if you can't fix it up there, would you mind bringing it back? Over.
Well, we're going to do our best to repair it tomorrow, sir, and if for some reason that is unsuccessful, which we don't think it will be, we will be able to return it.
This mission represents the end of an era of throwaway spacecrafts, and what we're doing here for the first time is spending about $45 million to $55 million to save a $235 million observatory. Well worth the investment.
This morning, the astronauts began their spacewalk at about 10 o'clock. Their first job, to take off the broken attitude control system, that's this whole square box, by loosening bolts at the top and bottom. They're now replacing it with a new one. So far, the repairs have gone like clockwork. Meanwhile, over Russia, the 3 cosmonauts, including the first Indian in space, who visited the Russians' Salyut-7 space station, said goodbye to their comrades and prepared to undock. They'd been in space 8 days. As they drifted away from the space station, Indian VIPs watched at Russia's mission control. The cosmonauts landed just before 11:45 this morning in a largely desert area of Kazakhstan. Russian cosmonauts land by parachute. During the mission, they took many photographs of India to help with farming projects and to look for likely oil reserves. The Indians shared in the celebration of a successful landing.
Station. They landed just east of the Aral Sea in Soviet Central Asia using the Soyuz ferrycraft that took the original crew up 63 days ago. They've left their newer spacecraft behind, which makes observers think that at least one member of the original crew might stay on to break the 211-day endurance record.
The astronauts put Solar Max to rights. Hello. Two of the astronauts on board the American space shuttle became repairmen today when they went on a spacewalk to fix the broken-down satellite Solar Max. The delicate repair work went so well that it took only 4 hours. Yesterday, Challenger's crew used the robot arm to grab the 6-meter-high satellite and maneuver it into the payload bay to be mended. Now it's hoped Solar Max will be able to get on with its vital study of the Sun. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnell, has been watching the operation from Kennedy Space Center, and hopefully I can talk to him on the telephone now. Yes. Reg, hello. How did the repair work go today?
Oh, marvellously, Paul. Astronaut Van Hoften was today's hero. Despite having to work in the equivalent of boxing gloves, he used scissors and screwdrivers to repair the solar satellite in 4 hours instead of 5. To replace 2 big attitude and fuse boxes, he had to remove 22 screws, but he had clips instead to put them back. Nelson's job was to move the replacement boxes around. Quite tricky, because with an Earth weight of 200 kilograms, once you move them, they're hard to stop. And at the end, they change places on the robot arm. And Boy George, as mission control called him, made a careful inspection high above the satellite and found a hole in the solar panel. I feel uncomfortable, as if I'm about to fall, he said. Are we over Africa? But he didn't fall. And the astronauts are now back in the airlock, and at this moment I'm watching the robot arm lifting the repaired satellite above Challenger. It'll be released tomorrow, and if it's working properly, it should be able to watch the Sun until the 1990s. If it isn't working, there'll still be time to grab it back and bring it home when Challenger lands on Friday.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. And India's first man in space returned safely to Earth today with 2 Soviet cosmonauts, ending their 8-day mission on board the orbiting space station Salyut 7. They touched down this morning exactly on time in the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan in the Soyuz descent craft. They were all said to be feeling well after the landing. Before entering Soyuz this morning, they said goodbye to the 3 other cosmonauts on board Salyut 7. During the mission, the crew carried out experiments that included using yoga to ease space sickness. As they drifted away from the space station, Indian and Russian officials watched from Earth. The re-entry and final landing went perfectly. As Soyuz touched down, there were celebrations at Mission Control as Indians and Russians joined hands together to congratulate one another. The work carried out in the mission is said to be of great value to Indian farming and mineral projects.
The American shuttle astronauts have now successfully repaired the defective Solar Max satellite. It took just 3 hours, half the time they'd allowed. Russia's Soyuz craft has landed safely in Soviet Central Asia. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, has been following today's developments.
It was a spectacular success. The repairs were carried out more quickly than expected. First, the astronauts replaced the box with the broken fuses, so the satellite can now be pointed accurately at the Sun. Then, as planned, they installed a small cover over a vent. And finally, they tackled the most complicated repair of all. They cut into the side of the satellite, then undid 22 tiny screws with a power screwdriver, exposing the main electronics box, which had gone wrong. With this replaced, all the experiments should now work perfectly. The satellite is due to be tested towards midnight tonight, and if everything is all right, it'll be deployed into space tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, the 3 cosmonauts, including an Indian, who visited the Russian space station Salyut 7, said farewell to their comrades in space this morning and undocked to return to Earth. They landed just before midday today.
Solar Max. Repairs were carried out in Challenger's open cargo bay 300 miles above the Earth.
Solar Max was the first satellite to be built on a special modular system designed to make it easy to repair in space. It was launched 4 years ago to study sunspot activity, but after only 10 months it blew 3 fuses in its attitude control system. It was the replacement of this module that was the astronauts' main task today, and it was completed with remarkable ease and ahead of schedule. It will allow scientists back on Earth to keep the satellite pointing towards the Sun. But at one point, George Nelson did get a spot of vertigo during his inspection of the satellite at the end of the robot arm.
Really an uncomfortable feeling.
Do you feel like you're going to fall?
I feel like I'm going to fall.
Later tonight, the satellite will be lifted out of the cargo bay on the robot arm while extensive checks are carried out on it from the ground. If it's in working order, they'll gently drop it back into orbit tomorrow. If it's still not working properly, it'll be brought back down aboard the shuttle for further repairs on Earth. On board the Soviet space station Salyut 7, the cosmonauts were saying goodbye to their 3 visitors today, including India's first spaceman. They touched down safely in Soviet Central Asia just before midday. The 3 cosmonauts they left behind in the space station look set for another marathon stay up in orbit.
Down of the Soyuz T-10 spacecraft. All 3 cosmonauts were well, including Rakesh Sharma, the first Indian into space. 2 American astronauts on the Space Shuttle Challenger have successfully started repairing the disabled satellite Solar Max, which they snatched from space yesterday. James Van Hoften, assisted by George Pinky Nelson, worked from a movable platform on the end of Challenger's remote-controlled arm. They first of all replaced Solar Max's attitude control module. Then they started on the much more difficult task of removing an electrical power box for the satellite's instruments. They'll now check the satellite thoroughly before returning it to space.
They took back with them reels of film and tape recordings of the scientific data they've collected during their week-long stay. The 3 cosmonauts they left behind in the space station look set for another marathon stay in orbit. The touchdown of the Soyuz craft was safely achieved just before midday in Soviet Central Asia. A fleet of planes and helicopters were patrolling the desert area in Kazakhstan, ready to help the cosmonauts out of their spacecraft. The Indian cosmonaut was immediately told he'd been made a hero of the Soviet Union and awarded the Order of Lenin with a gold star. Then, to celebrate the success of their mission, they all put their autographs on the side of their spacecraft.
The Ministry of Defense is expected to announce tomorrow that it's buying the American Harpoon missile in preference to its British counterpart. The reason why? In part 2. Also in America, Walter Mondale looks a winner for the
by putting the Solar Max satellite back into orbit. The $77 million satellite had been out of order for 3 years, but now it seems to be working normally again, and it should soon resume its job of sending information about the Sun to scientists on Earth. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reports.
The shuttle mission has so far exceeded all expectations. The astronauts finished their repairs yesterday with several hours to spare. So they decided to test out the manned maneuvering units again. Ox Van Hoften went for his first ride with a backpack, floating gently out of the payload bay. Altogether, the spacewalk lasted over 7 hours, almost a record. Only once before have astronauts spent so long out of the safety of their space vehicle, and that was in the days of the Apollo program. Once they had finished, the Solar Max satellite was gently lifted out of its cradle, and just before 10:30 this morning was released. The shuttle is now a few hundred feet away, watching as the controllers on Earth make their final checks on the satellite. If all is well, the shuttle will move further away, and the astronauts will prepare for their return to Earth. The shuttle is expected to land at the Kennedy Space Center soon after lunch tomorrow.
Indeed, the mission's due to end tomorrow when the shuttle is scheduled to touch down at Cape Canaveral shortly after 1 o'clock lunchtime. So we'll be staying open with an extended edition of News Afternoon with the live coverage on the shuttle's return from orbit and touchdown at the Cape.
Challenger have successfully completed their mission to put a damaged satellite back to work. Now the astronauts are preparing for their return to Earth early tomorrow afternoon.
The Max satellite is now back in orbit and functioning perfectly. It was dropped into space by the shuttle's robot arm early this morning, after the longest spacewalk ever by the 2 astronaut repairmen. The satellite, which broke down only 10 months after its launch 4 years ago, will now be able to resume its study of sunspot activity. These giant solar flares still remain something of a mystery to scientists. Even at a distance of 93 million miles, they can disrupt communications back here on Earth. Solar Max will now be able to send back information on them for another 2 years at least. It would have cost more than £160 million to replace Solar Max with another satellite. As it is, the repair has cost a mere £30 million. The shuttle tailed the satellite for 1 orbit round the Earth to make sure nothing went wrong. The 5 astronauts are now making preparations for a return to Cape Canaveral at lunchtime tomorrow.
With Solar Max safely back in orbit, America's astronauts chat to newsmen. Hello, the satellite Solar Max is back in orbit in full working order and getting ready to start sending valuable information about the Sun. The astronauts on board America's space shuttle today used the robot arm to put the satellite back, completing the historic rescue operation. It's the first time a broken satellite has been mended in space. When they'd finished this morning's operation, the crew talked to reporters on the ground, and astronaut George Nelson gave his reaction to our space editor to the nickname that Mission Control have given him, Boy George. The British pop star is touring America at the moment and causing quite a stir. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching today's activities from Kennedy Space Centre.
Restored to perfect health by history's first space repair job, the Solar Max satellite has been released by Challenger to resume work. 460 kilometers above Earth, it's not quite as high as it should be. Challenger used too much fuel collecting it to take it any higher. And it'll need about 30 days to retune its fine pointing system. Then, after a 4-year gap, British scientists will be among those resuming a careful study of how the Sun works. For the Rutherford, Appleton and Mullard space laboratories have instruments on it which measure the Sun's 25 million degree solar flares and the amount of energy they send us. It was a happy and relaxed crew that talked to us soon after, and I asked astronaut George Nelson about his nickname.
You've been referred to once or twice by Mission Control as Boy George. Is that the sort of music you and the rest of the crew would appreciate up there?
I can only speak for myself. I don't mind it.
And here at the Cape, the weather looks good for Challenger's return at dawn tomorrow, 1:07 p.m. British time.
They've mended the Solar Max satellite and put it back into orbit. Space agency officials say they've opened a whole new era in space. Now they may be able to retrieve the 2 satellites they lost on the last shuttle mission, and other repairs are planned. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
It's been a remarkable mission. After yesterday's successful repairs, the Solar Max satellite was lifted out of its cradle and held aloft for some hours while scientists tested it. Then, in a tricky maneuver, it was gently released from the arm. That's the arm on the right. The space shuttle moved away and kept a watchful eye as more tests were done by scientists on Earth. They found all the instruments on board working perfectly. The satellite had locked itself onto the Sun as planned within minutes of its release. Solar Max is in a higher orbit than at the start of the mission, and now has several more years of life. It's the only observatory of its kind studying solar flares, great explosions on the Sun's surface, which, among other things, affect communications on Earth. The repair, which cost under £40 million, has saved a satellite worth over £150 million and proved that servicing satellites is realistic. The mission has paved the way for another satellite repair in a few years' time. Landsat 4, which takes pictures of the Earth, has trouble with its solar panel power cables, and it's possible they could be replaced. There's only one more hurdle for the latest shuttle mission, the landing, just after lunchtime tomorrow.
They are getting ready to return to Earth, having completed their repairs to the faulty satellite Solar Max.
The Solar Max satellite is now back in orbit and functioning perfectly. It was dropped into space by the shuttle's robot arm early this morning, after the longest spacewalk ever by the 2 astronaut repairmen. The satellite, which broke down only 10 months after its launch 4 years ago, will now be able to resume its study of sunspot activity. These giant solar flares still remain something of a mystery to scientists. Even at a distance of 93 million miles, they can disrupt communications back here on Earth. Solar Max will now be able to send back information on them for another 2 years at least. It would have cost more than £160 million to replace Solar Max with another satellite. As it is, the repair has cost a mere £30 million. The shuttle tailed the satellite for one orbit round the Earth to make sure nothing went wrong. The 5 astronauts are now making preparations for a return to Cape Canaveral at lunchtime tomorrow.
Over Cape Canaveral, they're now due down just after 2:45 this afternoon. There's our science correspondent James Wilkinson.
Everything had looked set for a landing soon after 1 o'clock today. The But just before they were due to fire their engine to slow themselves down, the decision was made to go for one more orbit. The weather at Cape Canaveral had deteriorated and there was too much cloud. The shuttle is now due to land at 2:36 at Edwards Air Force Base. This is a big change from previously. Only a few moments ago, it was thought it would be landing back at the Kennedy Space Center at about 2:45 this afternoon. Earlier, as the now repaired Solar Max was deployed, NASA gave it a tuneful send-off, and the astronauts took advantage of the television cameras to do some free advertising.
Challenger Houston, we'd like the radar measurements in inhibit, please.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you, and the Solar Max is go for release.
Release me and let me fly again.
Challenger Houston, your go for release as long as you're within 5 degrees.
That vibration is jets firing. Set burn has been initiated.
And Challenger Houston, the Solar Max is looking good. You're clear to stop station keeping anytime.
Well, you've got any problems. We'll just go ahead and sit here until we get to it.
POC reports they have activated safe hold.
The second mode, using the robot arm, worked extremely well, and they put out this long exposure satellite as well, very important. So all in all, very successful mission.
Do you think it has now rebuilt people's confidence in the shuttle?
Very much so, because I think in these early days one must expect certain failures, as I've said before, and the fact they can recover from it so well and successfully, I think this is very much to their credit. Tremendous confidence, I think, in the future for this shuttle use.
Now, of course, on the last mission, they lost 2 satellites. Is it possible that they could now go out and recover those?
Yes, quite a bit of serious thought is now being given to that. The 2 orbits were not impossible by any means. They looked pretty grim at the time, and of course they're useless for operational use. But there's now some quite serious consideration that these could be recaptured. That would be a tremendous achievement, because of course that was totally unexpected, and it was the rocket stages, of course, and the satellites that failed, unlike the satellites themselves. If they do that, I think they're really showing the versatility of this system.
Are there other satellites out there which are in need of repair?
Yes, several. In fact, one test was done in this particular mission to possibly refuel an Earth observation satellite called Landsat-4. Very important. It's observing the Earth for natural resources and many things, and it's lower on fuel than they'd like. So there's a good possibility, since this particular refueling simulation in the payload bay was successful, that they can, in a year or two's time, capture this, refuel it and put it back in orbit. It is in a polar orbit, so it's a mission for the future because it's inclined too much from the equator from the flights they've done so far. But it all looks very good for the future, to the space station early in the next decade, which is now committed. And the shuttle, I think, is demonstrating well its ability to both launch satellites and bring them in and repair them.
Jeffrey Pardo, thanks very much for joining us. And we'll have live coverage of the landing on BBC Two this afternoon, starting just after 2:30. Mrs. Thatcher's iron reputation was put to the test on a tour of the London Docklands this morning.
Satellite Solar Max sorted out its problems and put it back into orbit. Challenger is due to touch down in about 8 minutes from now at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The reason for the change in the landing site is simply the weather. At the Cape there was a huge cloud bank at 25,000 feet. Rain was threatening and there was fog as well. So the decision was taken to go for Edwards Air Force Base. They'll be landing on runway 17. That's a concrete runway, and the shuttle has landed there before. They also have a full support team there to make the shuttle safe after it lands. Earlier in the mission, we saw the moment when the shuttle's remote-controlled arm released Solar Max, and an unusual spot of advertising in space by Challenger's crew. They had good reason to be proud of what they'd done. Only one thing remained, redeploying the satellite.
Thank you, and the Solar Max is go for release.
Release me and let me fly again.
Challenger Houston, your go for release as long as you're within 5 degrees.
It had to be released gently to avoid it tumbling and getting out of control. The satellite was once more back in business, much to the delight of solar scientists on Earth.
And Challenger Houston, the Solar Max is looking good. You're clear to stop station keeping anytime.
POC reports they have activated safe hold and Solar Max is dead on the sun.
this morning's pictures from space. I have with me the space consultant Geoffrey Pardo, who's followed all the shuttle missions so far. Geoffrey, will the last-minute change to Edwards Air Force Base cause any particular problems for them?
No problems, really. It's a slight inconvenience because had it landed at the Cape, of course, it was where it's due to go off next time later this year. Now they have to put it back on the aircraft and carry it back to the Cape, but otherwise it's routine.
Will the mission, what will they do with the Challenger once it's down?
Essentially, the routine has been tightened up quite a bit from the early flights. Firstly, they have to make safe all of the onboard systems and equipment, and they have to be sure that the gases which come out are blown away so that it's absolutely safe. Otherwise...
We've just got the first pictures from NASA, in fact, and we're just going to them now. And we see the shuttle just coming into view in the what look like fairly clear skies over Edwards Air Force Base.
That's encouraging.
The mission has been a great success, hasn't it, Geoffrey?
Oh, very great success. In financial terms, after all, it would have cost well over $200 million to replace Solar Max, whereas for approximately $50 million part of the flight, they've repaired it and given it a new lease of life.
There was that docking problem there, wasn't there, which must have been an embarrassment to the people who made the docking device, because that was the only thing that went wrong, wasn't it?
Well, yes, most unfortunate, really, because one does expect mechanical things at this stage to work properly, and the pins, which, or rather the latches, which should have actually docked firmly, just didn't work properly. Most unfortunate. But having said that, I think it's a credit to NASA. They have the ingenuity and the fallback position to recover the mission by using the remote manipulator system, the robot arm, which of course would have in any case been the method of getting it back into the payload bay.
We'll just listen to NASA.
Altitude 55,000.
Those bursts of what look like smoke from the shuttle are the way the shuttle changes its position, aren't they?
Yes, it's the aerodynamic loading as he turns, causing condensation, a sort of contrail effect.
Miles per hour.
What he's doing is burning up energy now to get the glide path, because that's all it is. It's a very heavy glider falling very quickly at this stage.
How far away are we from touchdown now, do you think?
Oh, about 5, 6, 7 minutes.
46,000 feet.
46,000 feet.
It comes down 14 times faster than a commercial airliner in terms of the rate of descent.
It's a familiar sight, but we never fail to marvel at it because it is quite amazing that it's been in space for a week, isn't it?
Well, it really is, and I think in aerodynamic terms that comes into the atmosphere at 400,000 feet at Mach 25 times the speed of sound. It lands at about 230 miles an hour, the same configuration. I think everyone who flies civil aircraft see all the flaps, etc., come out before landing. There are no flaps on this excellent design of shuttle. It's the same configuration right the way down.
Beautiful picture there as it comes into the sunshine.
Very good indeed.
In the early morning of...
That's right.
In California.
Chase planes haven't formated onto it yet, but that, of course, is a very good shot from the optical systems. They have very close tracking now of the shuttle on these recent flights.
In previous missions, after they've actually landed, they've had trouble with the brakes, haven't they? Now, what's been going wrong?
Well, it's strange, of course, because although the whole process can be done by the computer coming down from orbit to land, the two things left to the astronauts, one is putting the landing gear down, and the other is putting the brakes on. And it's no fault of the astronauts controlling the vehicle, but the brakes have, in fact, jammed somewhat. They haven't been smooth in operation. They've had to be changed. And again, it's slightly strange. It's a relatively simple mechanical piece of equipment. They will get it right, but it's, I suppose it shows they're human, is perhaps all of anything you can say about it.
20,000.
Hello, Chris. Chase is aboard. Hello, Chase.
Now he's actually coming on a big circle, a sort of an imaginary cylinder he flies around, the terminal energy management, they call it. And that's designed by a computer to use up just the right amount of energy and in the right glide path so that when he comes off this big turn, he's directly lined up with the runway.
This is an automatic landing, virtually.
This is an automatic landing.
Nice shot there of it coming straight for the camera.
I've talked to the astronauts, of course, and it's quite strange. It's totally silent. It is a glider.
The astronauts are not terribly talkative in this last phase because, of course, they've got to keep their attention on what the shuttle is doing, haven't they?
Very much so, because although it is automatic, they can, and indeed have taken over and tested in the past, that the men can land the whole last phase if necessary.
Of course, the astronauts are not alone up there, are they? They have some 3,500 bees with them. I wonder if they've been giving any problems.
Well, they haven't escaped, that's fortunate, but how well they've made their honeycombs in a weightless condition remains to be seen.
600 feet.
They put the landing gear down at 300 feet above the ground and minus 22 seconds before touchdown. Quite late.
Let's join the NASA sound while we watch it on its final approach.
3,000 feet.
You got that wrong, 300 feet.
Quite a lot of dust there, even though it's a concrete runway, isn't it?
That's true.
And it's down.
Beautiful. The air brake is just closing on the fin.
Well, as we said earlier, this has been the most ambitious shuttle mission so far, but it hasn't been without its tensions and problems.
We are go for main engine start, 8.
NASA expected great things from this mission. In the event, they were not disappointed.
2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger and the first flight to repair a satellite in space. We have cleared the tower.
The shuttle was launched a week ago today to the highest orbit yet flown by the shuttle, and with the heaviest ever payload on board, nearly 10 tons. The next day it deployed those 10 tons into orbit. A satellite with over 57 experiments on board, in one of which were millions of tomato seeds. The satellite will be collected next year and brought back to Earth. Then the first sign of trouble. Attempts by George Pinky Nelson to dock with the Solar Max failed. His docking mechanism wouldn't latch. Bumping into the satellite made it wobble more. He tried to stabilize it by holding onto a solar panel. But he was running out of gas in his jetpack, and NASA ordered him back to the shuttle. NASA used on-board systems to slow the satellite to a very slow spin, and then had a go with the remote-controlled arm. It grabbed it at the first attempt.
Got it, and we're in the process of putting in the FSF. Outstanding.
Once safely in the payload bay, the rest was easy. They replaced the damaged control system with a new one, which meant the satellite could now be pointed accurately at the sun. And they replaced an electronics box in the side of Solar Max. This maneuver involved cutting into the satellite and undoing 22 tiny screws. The electronics box was never designed to be replaced in orbit. The impromptu repair proved an added bonus. It shows that satellites in low orbit are no longer disposable. They can be captured, mended, even brought back to Earth. There'll be an inquest on that docking mechanism which failed, but for the rest, NASA couldn't have wished for more. So, back in California, the shuttle is safely back on the Earth, back in the desert, and the convoy of vehicles is now approaching it to make it safe. Jeffrey, another successful mission. There is, the next mission will be with a new shuttle vehicle, won't it, called Discovery. Now, why have they got another one?
Well, it's one of the 4 which NASA have ordered and are having made. It's a fleet which is necessary because they have a very heavy transportation schedule in years ahead, and they've judged that they need 4 to cope with the turnaround time and the number of satellites and the payloads they have to put up and bring back.
That's four shuttle vehicles. Originally, there were going to be 5, weren't there? What happened to the 5th?
Well, they decided that with the scheduling that they could foresee and the orders they had, they could live with 4, but the 5th is there potentially, and indeed there's quite strong consideration still being given, perhaps increasingly I should say, being given by private enterprise to fund and purchase that shuttle. Because if they do, that means then a private organisation backed heavily by banks and the various people who can see the commercial benefits from space would be able to mount their own missions, to take up equipment and payloads, to launch satellites, but I think particularly for the material processing and the work which is expected in the space station in the future. So if you add it all together, there's an increasing number of commercial operations, and people are deeming it sufficiently interesting to consider funding to the tune of about $1 billion, typically, the purchase of the 5th shuttle.
And yet the whole shuttle program is in fact years behind schedule, isn't it?
Well, it is, and of course for that reason expendable rockets have had to continue to be used, not only American ones. It's perhaps helped to pave the way of opportunity for the European Ariane, the expendable liquid fuel rocket, which is now performing very successfully, of course, I'm pleased to say, and is providing certainly quite a percentage of the total world's payload launching capability. I think this will continue. So even though the delay is about 3 years or so from the time that they'd first hoped to have the shuttle available, I think they're beginning to catch up with their scheduling, but I think they have certainly left the position with a mixture of shuttle flights for that for which it's best suited, as well as expendable rocket flights of the Ariane, but also American commercial rockets are being built as well now.
In the early days, they were talking of a shuttle flight almost every week, weren't they, at about the late 80s and so on. Will that ever come, do you think?
There are no signs of it building up to quite that so far. They had designed the shuttles to be refurbished and turned around, in fact, in 14 days. They're down to about a month now, but I think they're going to have possibly difficulties in turning around in 14 days. They may not need to. I think when we get towards the end of the decade and space station is really beginning to come along, and indeed when space station is there, then I think we might see that frequency building up. But I think possibly the expendables are going to fill a few of the gaps, and hence the 4 shuttles at the moment is all that NASA wishes to own and operate themselves.
And we've heard a lot about the Russians, in particular, during the last week. They've had their cosmonauts up, including an Indian cosmonaut. Yes. How do we really compare with the Russians? How does the West compare with the Russians?
Well, the Russians now have far more man experience in terms of man days in orbit than the Americans, even though the Americans, of course, had the uniquely successful Apollo series of missions way back. But the Russians, after all, have had 7 major space stations in orbit. The 7th is there now, and they've accumulated a lot of experience. They clearly have addressed the Earth orbiting situation as one they want to really get firmly their hands on and their experience with before they allow themselves to go out, perhaps with men, to the moon. So at the moment, I think the technology deployed by the Americans in the shuttle is certainly well in advance, of course, of the Russians, who are several years away from having what is probably a somewhat smaller type of shuttle, and probably not launched on a sort of recoverable first stage, well, recoverable in the sense that the solid rockets are used again. So I think the Russians are a little behind on getting up there, but they're certainly ahead still in terms of experience of men in space.
Well, Geoffrey, another successful mission over. Thank you very much for coming in to talking to us about it.
Pleasure.
So Challenger is safely back on Earth. In about a quarter of an hour or so, the 5 crewmen will emerge from the shuttle. We'll have pictures of their welcome home in our 5:40 news on BBC One. From the newsroom and from Edwards Air Force Base in California, good afternoon.
happy landings. The time now approaching 40.
In California. Its crew had carried out the first orbital satellite repair job, but they landed more than 2,000 miles away from base and an hour and a half late.
It was the 11th landing from space, and like all the others, it went without a hitch.
Challenger Houston, looking good on final. Winds are calm. I got a wind.
The shuttle approached runway 17 on a steep glide path. The decision to land at the Edwards Air Force Base in California was taken at the last minute because of clouds and fog at Cape Canaveral. But engineers there were ready for it. A duplicate support team is always standing by for just such an event. The landing itself seemed perfect.
Unofficial touchdown time 7:38:05.
A short while later, the astronauts left the shuttle looking relaxed and happy now they'd completed their mission. Earlier, the astronauts had taken advantage of the television cameras and advertised their success at mending damaged satellites. Their climax had come when Solar Max, now back in business, had been released to a tuneful accompaniment from Mission Control.
Release me and let me fly again.
Shuttle Challenger ended what turned out to be a successful 7-day mission with only a handful of people there to see it land. Rain and cloud kept the shuttle from landing at Cape Canaveral in Florida, so it came down instead at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. Challenger's crew did the first repair and relaunch in space of a faulty satellite and the longest space walk.
Waiting for the first visual sighting of the shuttle as it drops out of space is always an anxious time. The heat on its outer skin builds up to 1,500 degrees centigrade as the friction of the atmosphere slows it from 15,000 miles an hour to 8,000. The heat's so great it ionizes the air around the shuttle and causes a radio blackout. Although the pilot has 3 sophisticated electronic guidance systems to help him in, he has no onboard power. He has to glide the shuttle down. That's why the astronauts call it the flying brick. In the last 2 minutes of the descent, it's under full manual control, and they leave the deployment of the landing gear to the last moment because of the effect it has on the aerodynamic profile of the shuttle. The touchdown at just over 200 miles an hour was perfect. It was the end to a successful mission which proved that satellites can be repaired in orbit and has ushered in a new era in space. To the command of the shuttle, Bob Crippen, it was all routine. It was his 3rd mission. For the other 4 members of his crew, it was their first time in space, as it was for the 3,000 honeybees they carried. They were taken away in a tray to see what effect it had on them.
Inflation in Britain edged up to 5.2% a year in March up north. They've been visiting Houston Space Center, but as Martin Bell reports, the one who'll be aboard the Space Shuttle next year is a long way from being chosen.
The trainee astronauts are on a preliminary tour. 4 days among the simulators and plywood mock-ups of the orbiter here at the Space Center. Not yet the real thing, but closer to it. There are 3 military men and 1 civilian. Navy, Army and Air Force are all represented, and under present plans, 1 of the 4 will go up in the shuttle next year and 1 the year after to help in the launch of military communications satellites. So there's a degree of competition, obviously, to be the first Briton in space. But the decision about who's to fly won't be made until much later. They're all on the same team and sharing the same training, and today at the Houston Space Center had the same feeling of being that bit nearer space travel.
It's our first chance to see some of the equipment, albeit in mock-up stage, to touch it and really start to get an understanding of what we're about, rather than sitting in London thinking about it.
Very exciting, isn't it? This is the first time we've actually seen anything that looks like what we've been reading about in the books. Beginning to all get the adrenaline going.
What about the living conditions?
Very palatial, very palatial.
Later there'll be an intensive 15-week training course here, and today the would-be astronauts had an introduction to some of the bits and pieces that they may be using. Household items like non-foaming soap. It's called here habitability equipment. That's something else the would-be astronauts must learn. Space agency jargon, which is the English language in orbit.
One step closer to choosing an astronaut to fly in the American Space Shuttle. The 4 potential candidates have started training at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where they've had a chance to work the controls for the first time in an exact replica of the shuttle.
Their first day of duty at NASA was spent touring the facilities at the Johnson Space Center near Houston, where much of their training will take place, including many hours in a full-scale mock-up of the space shuttle. They'll be trained as payload specialists, and their job will be to oversee the launch of a Royal Naval Communications satellite known as Skynet 4. Despite the sheer size of the shuttle, the conditions in the living quarters and flight deck, where each of the astronauts took a turn behind the controls, are decidedly cramped. But Commander Longhurst wouldn't hear any criticism of any part of the shuttle.
We're being friendly here. No, that's a fine space loop.
They'll be spending another 3 days at the Johnson Space Center talking over the details of their training program.
You know, at last there's a sense of being able to touch something and really see what this business is about that we're coming into.
Is there any rivalry between you? Are you all sort of watching each other like boxers?
No, no. There certainly isn't any yet. We've no idea of the criteria that are going to be used to select the final choice, so there's hardly any point in competing.
But you're all confident that you can be the man. Each one of you can be the man.
I think we've all got a good chance, and we all have to work hard and see where we get to. And when the selection's made, the two who aren't selected will back up the two probably who are, so it's all a very close-knit team.
What the payload specialists have been getting today is what the Americans call some hands-on experience. In the next few months, they'll face a whole battery of medical and psychological tests and some rigorous training. That'll be another 12 months yet before it's decided which one of them will go up in the shuttle.